skit notes of Scotland and Ireland, and there's not quite as many of them as there are in England, of course. So you might recognise one or two of the designs anyway. So I think there's probably 4 different types of skit note. There are those that are intended to deceive. So they are, produced by people who are trying to cheat somebody else out of money. There are those that are intended to entertain, and we've seen quite a lot of those from Pam's, what Pam was showing. And then there are certainly those that have got political or satirical intent, and you do see a few of those around in Scotland and Ireland, not so many. And then there are advertising notes, which generally look like regular issued notes, Scottish, Irish, or indeed Bank of England ones. There's quite a few of those around, certainly in past years. Anyway, so there's those 4 groups. I have tried to group the slides to reflect that, but in some cases you really don't know why the thing was produced and issued, and so you can only guess as to what the intent was, whether it was entertainment or deception. Anyway, I'm going to press on. Now this one is, I'm afraid, it's not in very good condition. The scan, unfortunately, I've had to blow it up a bit, and it's become a bit sort of fuzzy. But this was issued in Falkirk in 1761, and it's signed by Credit and Holidays, and it promises to pay somebody or the bearer 5 shillings sterling value received. And it also says £3 Scots, which is the equivalent of 5 shillings sterling. But Credit and Holidays are quite clearly fictitious names. And so this was probably one of those that was prepared and put out by people trying to deceive other people. Now this one, for anyone who collects Scottish notes, this is quite well known. The Mason Barrowman. The Mason Barrowman Company, I'm not absolutely sure if it actually existed as a sort of trade company, but there's a tiny picture of a guy with a hod, and in fact the note refers to somebody called Solomon Hod. But these notes were produced in, well, it's dated 1764, and at the time people weren't sure whether they were done, well, to quote from the Scots magazine of the time, whether these notes were issued for wit or for gain, but they have been passed on ignorant or heedless persons to be notes for 5 shillings or 10 shillings. So the original intent may not have been to deceive, but some people were using it to deceive others. And you get them with different signatures. This one's signed by William Johnston, but there are others signed by Barclay Cash and strange people like that. But I think the intent was, it's got an option clause, which at the time, in 1765, option notes were banned in Scotland. The banks would gather up the notes of their competitors and try and present them all at once, and then embarrassingly, the bank is unable to redeem the notes for gold or silver. Then that would bring the reputation of that bank into question, and so banks started issuing notes with an option, so not just pay the bearer on demand, but at the option of the directors, pay the bearer on demand now, or in 6 months' time. So it would give them a time period. And this has got an option clause in it, which I think is intended to be a sort of satirical comment on the option notes that all the main banks, Bank of Scotland, Royal Bank, and so on, were issuing at that time. So it's quite well known. They're not that difficult to find, but I think it's a good one to have in a big Scottish collection. So we're moving on. We've got another one here. This is issued in Montrose a little bit later, 1832, and it says here, signed by Thomas Tickler, which is obviously a fictitious name, promised to pay Tibby Fowler, which doesn't sound a very realistic name, or bearer 1 shilling sterling in cash, or an Edinburgh 20 shillings banknote for 20 of these. So I think this is another one that was probably intended to deceive. although it may have been just an entertainment. But it did appear in Montrose, 1832. There's not many of them around. I think I've got a scan. I don't have a note itself, and I think this is the only one I've seen, actually. So it's quite a nice, interesting piece. It's written along the top for reasons unknown. It says Bank of Venice. No idea why that's there. Venice and Montrose have very little to do with each other. And now here is one that definitely was issued with the intent to deceive. It looks like, roughly, like an Aberdeen note of the time. There were a few, I think, 2 banks operating in Aberdeen when this note was issued in 1797. But this is the Company of the Bank of Aberdeen, which never existed. It was a fictitious issuer. And, the note was clearly intended to deceive. And in fact, a history book from roughly that period, well, a little bit later, from the 1860s, referred to it as false notes. A quantity of notes purporting to be guinea notes of the Company of the Bank of Aberdeen were put into circulation. No such bank existed, and they may be called either forgeries or counterfeits. Now, unfortunately, we don't know anything else about this institution, if that's the right word, or the people who signed the notes. But I think it does belong in the skit note category, and it's definitely a note that was issued with the intention of deceiving others. And it looks like they circulated, so somebody was getting a guinea for a worthless piece of paper. Now, here's another one I think that was definitely intended to deceive. It looks like it's a note issued in Glasgow in 1824. It promises to pay. The governor and the company of the Glasgow Union Bank promised to pay the bearer on demand the sum of 20 gold sovereigns, it says here. The 20 is written in by hand. And in witness whereof the above signatures have been affixed by their authority. Now, this was a fictitious institution. The Union Bank of Scotland, the Glasgow Union Bank, did not exist in 1824. And yet these notes did, it seemed, were accepted erroneously by people. And we have on record, and we've got this in Paper Money of Scotland, that in 1879, or so 50 years or so later than the date on the note, one of these was paid in at the Clydesdale Bank, who sent it on to the Union Bank of Scotland, who returned it saying worthless and a forgery, which it self-evidently is. I mean, there's no Scottish notes were ever issued in denominations of gold sovereigns. So it's a very interesting item, I think. And almost definitely its sole purpose was to deceive others. And we have no record of any of the individuals who signed the note or are mentioned in the note. No record of any of these people. So, as I say, it belongs in the skit note category, but I think it's a deliberate deception. Now, this one is, I think, more of an entertainment, and probably with a bit of satire thrown in. It's got an option clause in it, and it refers to bankers, fictitious bankers in Glasgow, promised to pay an individual, James Gardner, all the bearer on demand, 3 pence sterling, or in the option of directors, 9 ballads, 6 days after a demand. So, an amusing thing. I think it's meant to be a satire on the option clause notes that were being issued by banks at that time. This note has a date. I can't see it on my screen, but it's got a date. When is it from? Yeah, 1765, which of course was the year that the option notes were finally banned by law in Scotland. Now, moving on to, I suppose you'd call it an advertising note, really. You may say that it was also a one for designed to entertain, but this was issued by the Prince's Theatre in Glasgow, 1863. April the 1st, incidentally, note the date. Pay the £5 if the holder of this note can give the requisite information about Brother Sam or his old nurse. Now, that's presumably what the Mrs. Edmund Glover was, what her production was all about at the Prince's Theatre. But anyway, it was quite an interesting piece. I've got this in my collection. I don't think I've ever seen any others on sale, but you know, I'm sure they do pop up from time to time. So quite an interesting one. The Bank of Dundreary. So get one of these and you're done with being dreary. Now here's a modern one. The Banknote of Scotland, it says. That's Sean Connery, of course. I found this thing on eBay. I mean, I think all these recent ones, which we didn't bother to catalogue, incidentally, just got up by people to entertain others. You know, anyone who's any good with Photoshop can put these things together in no time at all. And there's quite a lot of them around. So I'm just going to give you a couple of instances of these things. Here's one which is very similar to that note that Pam showed earlier, the St. Andrews and Fife Bank. Now, there's a gentleman whose name somebody can tell me because I've forgotten, who's produced several of these notes. They're very authentic. Sorry?
Tom Branton.
Is that it? Okay. And this one here is mentions Tom Morris, who of course was the famous golfer who, oh yeah, actually his name, you're right, Pam, the name's at the bottom, tombrantonart.com. Quite a nice piece, purely for entertainment, very good looking, I think. And of course, a fictitious bank. Now this one is a little bit earlier. There's no date on it, but I think it was probably produced when these notes first came out. It's based on a Royal Bank pound, probably from 1987, and it's issued in the name of the Tarbolton Savings Bank. Now, I don't think that bank, savings bank, actually existed, and Tarbolton is a real place. And that's Robert Burns, of course, Rabbie Burns to Scots, the national poet of Scotland. This is quite a nice piece. And on the back, there's another clue here, Brother Robert Burns and the Lodge of St. James. And this is a Freemasons lodge that does actually still exist in Tarbolton. So that's they obviously decided they would get one of these up to celebrate possibly a Burns night, but quite a nice piece. It's plastic, by the way, though I think it's paper that's been laminated rather than an actual polymer note. Now here, this one has a political intent to it. There's a great story that Scottish collectors will know about, which was Sir Walter Scott in 1826 started a campaign to ensure that the pound note in Scotland would be exempted from the law that was being passed in England that was going to ban all banks, particularly the provincial banks, the country banks in England, to ban them from issuing pound notes because there had been far too much issuance, particularly in England, and a lot of the banks were going bust, and it was becoming in economic terms, it was becoming very difficult. There had been a bit of a crisis of confidence in paper money. He won that particular campaign, and he wrote a lot of letters, or a series of letters, using the fictitious name of Malachi Malagrowther. And this note was produced 20 years later. Walter Scott had already died then, of course. And that picture on the left is the Scott Monument in Princes Street in Edinburgh. And I think this was produced in 1846, just after the Scottish Banking Act was passed, which didn't affect the banks of issue in the sense that they could all continue to issue notes, and they'd already been doing so when the Act was passed. But the concern was that in the future, as those banks were either taken over or went out of business, no new banking licenses or no new licenses to issue notes would be issued in Scotland. And so I think this was another attempt to campaign against that. Yeah, the law, in fact, stood, and no new banks got a banknote issuing license after 1845. But I think for anyone who collects Scottish notes, it's got great historical context. This particular note, it's sort of in the style of the square pound notes of the time, and in the name of Malachi Malagrowther, the creation of Walter Scott, it promises to pay every supporter of the £1 note system in Scotland 20 shillings sterling if they will join heart and hand in defending that foundation of Caledonia's prosperity. And it's issued by order of the Court of Blue Bonnets. I think that was a campaign group from the time, but I don't know anything else about them. I'm sure one of our Scottish members will be able to enlarge on that, but that's all I can tell you about it. But it's a very nice piece and well worth having in any comprehensive Scottish collection. Right, okay, now this is a cartoon, obviously. These notes never existed, and these are two political figures that are no longer at the forefront of politics, shall we say. This was produced, I'm not quite sure when, there's no dates on these things, but the gentleman on the left is Alex Salmond, of course, who was the First Minister of Scotland for a number of years. Bank of Brigadoon, it says, I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of £1,000, and it's signed by Wee Eck, which was his nickname, the great chieftain of the pudding race. And the fellow on the right is Danny Alexander, who was a Liberal Democrat politician between 2010 and 2015. He was Chief Secretary to the Treasury, was actually much disliked in Scotland, even though he was a good Scot and came from Inverness and was the MP there, but he got voted out in 2015 and left politics. But anyway, it's just a cartoon and a bit of fun. And, he's the cartoon there is rather inferring that Danny Alexander lived in La La Land, which he may well have done. Now, I'm going to go through some advertising notes. This one's got a bit of a story. Lipton's is a well-known name in Britain, based in Glasgow, and Lipton's were, they're known as much for their tea as anything else, but this is also refers to the great Irish ham, butter and egg markets, and promise to pay the bearer on demand ham, butter and eggs to the value of £1 for 15 shillings. So anyway, Lipton's put this thing out as basically to advertise his business. It's very similar to a National Bank of Scotland note of the time. And in fact, the National Bank of Scotland managed to get under Scottish law what was called an interdict. So basically, it prohibited Lipton's from continuing to issue these things, and they had to withdraw them. So if you can be able to get hold of one, you're doing quite well, because there's not many out there to be collected. And as I say, it's very, very similar to the National Bank of Scotland note of the time. And I'll show you one in a second. This is David Bain. He's another Glasgow tradesman who issued notes. And again, they look similar to the Scottish square notes of the time. And this is Craig and Simpson. Now, these people were also based in Glasgow, seem to have been a feature of Glasgow trading life, that they all felt they had to produce notes. This thing is actually beautifully engraved and is very, very similar also to the National Bank of Scotland note of the time. This one is dated 1829. And it's a steel plate engraving, very good quality. That's the Scottish coat of arms at the top and the cross of St. Andrew. Very, very nice piece. On the back of it, it advertises all the things that Craig and Simpson sold. And as you can see, there's a vast amount of stuff here. Woolens, linens, cottons, laces, muslins, which is different types of material, and sundries, including hosiery, gloves, cravats, nightcaps, all sorts of things. So a great piece to have in your Scottish collection. And this is what they were based on. And you can see the similarity. This is a standard National Bank of Scotland pound note from, this is dated 1832, but you can see that that design and that are almost identical. You just, it's quite difficult to see the difference. And you can see why they went against Lipton's. I don't know whether they ever went against Craig and Simpson, but they certainly got Lipton's to reduce their rather similar looking note. So moving on, more advertising notes. We're still in Glasgow. This one is a cloth warehouse by Morris and Company. It's a pound note, quite a nice piece. And then here's another one by William Kirkwood. And then you can see the designs of these two notes are quite similar. And in fact, it's the same address. This cloth warehouse, its address there is 18 Hutchison Street in Glasgow. And here, dated a year later, William Kirkwood, drapers of the very same address. So they were either one took the other over, or they were both doing business from the same address. And these are, incidentally, these are not just advertising notes. These are credit notes. They actually genuinely saying the holder of this note can get exchange it for £1 worth of goods at the store concerned. And these were based on actual bank notes of the time. Here is a Commercial Bank of Scotland note from that period, and you can see the similarities between that one and that one. Very similar design features, and actually these tradesman notes were very, very good quality. Now, moving on. Oh, here's another. This is yet again. This is Glasgow tradesman, also in Trongate, incidentally, which is just around the corner from Hutchison Street. John Richmond and Son, quite a nice pound note. Again, it's a credit note. Now here's another one. This one I've only ever seen once, and it came up in auction many years ago, and sadly somebody else bought it, not me. But it is purports to be for £100. It mentions Royal Bank on the left. But it's the Royal Bank of Fashion. The Royal Bank of Fashion mills at the, oh God, I can't read that. Civic, it looks like Civic catalogue. I'm really not sure. Anyway, High Street will undertake to arrange hair in the most elegant manner or forfeit the sum of £100 sterling. So, it's quite similar to other sort of Bank of Elegance type notes. But it's based on a Royal Bank of Scotland note from the 1820s, and here it is. That's the actual note, and that's the Skit note. So you can see the similarity. And this note, by the way, is not from Edinburgh; it's from Dundee. Obviously, the Royal Bank was based in Edinburgh. So quite an interesting piece again. Now this is not based on any particular banknote design, but the Bank of Economy. It's an advertising note for James Gibb in St. Patrick's Square in Edinburgh. I found this years and years ago. In fact, I think Pam might have sold me this thing. I've never seen another one, but it's rather nice. It's undated. I think it's probably late 19th century, but it's impossible to tell. But Bank of Economy, which is a Skit note that you see in England as well. And then you've got Bank of Elegance. Well, the Bank of Elegance seems to have been a very popular name. This is similar, actually, again, to a Bank of England note. But unlike the other banks of elegance that you see around, this one was issued in Edinburgh, 1823, 44 South Bridge. So, in fact, it's quite difficult to get these Bank of Elegance notes from Scottish issuers, so it's quite a nice one. And then finally, here's a note that has only come up, I think, once. It was in an auction in Edinburgh, I think last year or a couple of years ago. The Bank of Whigs, and it's the Bank of Whigs promised to be at home on Mondays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays to cut and dress hair fit on wigs, and every lawful day me or my people all pay 5 shillings if I'm absent from work. So anyway, there we are. Very nice very interesting skit note, advertising note, I suppose, and quite clearly based on Bank of England note designs from the time. So those are the Scottish ones. I'm going to move on to Ireland now. And whoops, sorry, I'm jumping ahead here. This one is, it's in there's several Irish skit notes based on Bank of Ireland pound notes of the time, or in fact, Bank of Ireland notes of any denomination of that time. It had these two standing Hibernia figures on the left and the right of the note. This is Bank of Hyman, which is obviously an entertainment note. 14th of February, of course, and it's to pay one love, to pay the bearer the just reward of their sincere affection. 1840. Sorry, no, it's not. It says 1860 something or 186. But it's based on a Bank of Ireland note. And here is the actual Bank of Ireland note from 1849. It's not a very good condition one, but extremely rare. Now, there are others based on this same design. Here's one here for the Theatre Royal in Dublin with two sort of jesters on either side. And it says it's the Bank of Fun. And it's for a pantomime in 1848, 26th of December, 1848, for a pantomime, which is a great British and obviously Irish tradition as the Christmas pantomimes. And that's quite a nice piece as well. Now this one, similar design, it's obviously done up by hand. Now the stretched out writing across it says it's the first draw in a prize drawing. So it's actually a sort of for a lottery or a tombola or something. But it's also in the style of a Bank of Ireland note. And these are also quite interesting notes. It's obviously not designed to deceive, I would say. I would say it's designed to entertain. And finally, here's an advertising note, very much again in the same design as the Bank of Ireland pound notes. And this is for a tea retailer or wholesaler, perhaps, in Dublin. And he's even got the text in red in the centre of the note in red. And the later Bank of Ireland pound notes of this design had all the branches listed across the centre, and they put those in red text. So I don't know if I can see a date on this, but it would be from a slightly later period, from the 1880s onwards. Now there's some other notes here. This is also the Theatre Royal in Dublin. This looks like it's based on an American design. Mr. George Edwards Company, the Dollar Princess, a special London company, it says, but it's obviously advertising something at the Theatre Royal in Dublin. And that's quite interesting advertising piece. And then you've got the Bank of Laughter. I'm sure there's English Bank of Laughters as well, but this is a Bank of Laughter. This is not worth twopence, much less £5. But you'll find the O'Day Gaiety Show will still be here, worth a visit. And this is produced under protest, it says, by Joseph O'Day in Dublin. I think it's rather a nice piece. Bank of Laughter. Now this one, I don't know what this is about. It's called the Emetic Court Bank in Dublin, and has a vignette, small vignette in the upper left corner of somebody being copiously sick all over his own into a bucket, I think. I don't quite know what all this is about, but it's really a bit unpleasant. But it promises to pay the bearer on demand the sum of 3p at Mr. Rhubarb's in London, but it's actually is issued in Dublin. So it's a rather strange piece. I don't quite know what the intent behind that note is. Now here's one that is satirical. There was a series of English skit notes from the early 19th century. They were numbered 1 to about, I think, 24 or something. and they're all going to be coming up in Noonans. This is number 3, and it's got Irish relevance. Promise to pay Rory O'Bog or bearer 2 pence when the union of the kingdom shall have produced a union of civil and religious principles, and it's for self, Leinster, Ulster, Munster, and Connaught, and it's signed by Pat Potato. So it's obviously satirical, and it's not particularly friendly towards the Irish, I would say. We did illustrate this in the first edition of Pay for Money of Ireland, but I'm not sure it's made it into the second edition because we ran out of space for skit notes and sundry items. And then here's a more modern one. It's obviously an English, well, it might have been a Bank of England £50 note, but anyway, it's been taken over by the Royal Irish Rangers. I don't make any political statements on it, but you can see there's a couple of paramilitaries there. And I don't think this is actually, it's obviously not meant for circulation, but it's a propaganda piece, I suppose you'd call it. Now, again, here's another Irish, an older advertising note, Dunville & Co. Royal Irish Distilleries in Belfast. These you see quite often, you see them around. They're quite nicely engraved. There is a variant of it, which you can see is the same sort of design of Dunville's and Company. But this is actually got a London address, and it's a draft on demand, paid to the order of so-and-so, the sum of £10 sterling. This is in Belfast. It's to be issued in Belfast, but it's payable at Dunville's in London. So it's an interesting variant on the advertising note, which is much more common, by the way. And now, Bank of Elegance also appeared in Ireland. This particular Bank of Elegance is in Cork. £500 if you don't get a decent gentleman's haircut at this Bank of Elegance in Cork, signed by Andrew Roach. Now, Roach is a well-known name in Cork and that part of Ireland. In fact, there was a Roach's Bank. But anyway, he signed this note, and I think it's just an advertising note, not in very good condition. This is probably based on a National Bank of Ireland note design. In fact, definitely is. And the Bank of Erin. Erin is the Irish for Ireland. And it's got an address down the bottom. For Griffin Wards, it says 68 South George's Street, South Great George's Street in Dublin. I've seen the very same note with an address, different address at the bottom, I think in Enniskillen, and you probably see a few others around. But anyway, it's quite an interesting, it's an advertising piece, because if you read it, it says it's about boots and shoes. Griffin Wards is presumably the name of the company that produced the boots and shoes. This is an advertising note. It's for fishing tackle. It's difficult to read, but anyway, it's basically for fishing tackle. It was issued in Dublin. And then finally, and this is the very last one before I leave you in peace, it's not really a skit note at all. It's an advertising note by Bradbury and Wilkinson's, La Banca Irlanda. Now, no Irish note was ever produced that looked anything like this. The text of the note is actually in Italian, and I don't know whether they produced any notes to sell to Italian banks that looked anything like this. But there are different designs. There are very with slightly different vignettes, and certainly in different colours that the Bradburys produced. But they are purely advertising notes. But I've included it in the Irish section because it says La Banca Irlanda, which is obviously the Irish for Bank of Ireland. So that's the last of my offerings. As you can see, there's quite a lot of similarities with the notes that Pam was showing, but a lot that are quite different and very much in tune with Scottish or Irish values at the time. So that's all I have to say.